1.
Hello and welcome to everyone online to today's webinar, which is integrating Snowflake with Azure Active Directory. My name is Regan and I am a sales engineer with Snowflake. I am based in New Zealand, and I also have my colleague Alan online, who is there ready and waiting to answer your questions through the Q&A panel if you have any. And then we'll also have a little bit of time at the end of the webinar for some live Q&A as well, if you have questions then. We will be recording this webinar, and you will get an email tomorrow with the link so that you can review this tomorrow and share it around with others as well. So without further ado, let's jump in and take a look. So as I said, this is a webinar around integrating Snowflake with Azure Active Directory, and there are a few things that we're going to cover on today's webinar. The first thing we're going to look at is, why does this matter? Why Azure Active Directory integration? We're going to dive into single sign-on, which is part of this. We're going to dive into automated user provisioning, and then we're going to go and actually have a look and have a demo of how we do our Azure AD configuration and set this all up and see it working. So first of all, why does this matter? Why do people want to integrate their Azure Active Directory with Snowflake? Well, essentially, it boils down to a few things. Customers really don't like having to remember lots of usernames and passwords. So what they want to do is they want to be able to use the same password that they use for their mail, for their other systems. They want to be able to use that username and password to also access Snowflake. From an administration point of view, the company administrators or the Snowflake administrators, they also want to be able to manage users and add them to Snowflake roles, but do that through their Active Directory tool rather than have to do that in a different interface through the Snowflake interface. And lastly, when you have a user in your organization and you want them to be able to log in and use Snowflake, you don't want to have to go and additionally create that user inside of Snowflake. You want that user to be automatically created through from your Active Directory so that they can just be assigned an Active Directory and then jump in and use Snowflake. So how we do this, we have two pieces of this puzzle. One of them is using federated authentication and SSO, and the other thing is using something called Azure SCIM integration. SCIM means System for Cross-Identity Management, and SSO means Single Sign-On. But essentially, with these two tools combined, you'll be able to both manage and authenticate users using Azure Active Directory, and you'll be able to automatically sync users and groups into Snowflake, and then use those for providing the permissions point for access to Snowflake objects. So first up, single sign-on. And single sign-on can be deployed on its own without automated user provisioning. But what it essentially is it allows you to log into Snowflake using your username and password from your Azure Active Directory. And when you log into Snowflake normally, you find a logon box that will typically say username and password. Once you've configured the integration with Azure AD, you'll actually get an additional button which will say login using Azure AD. And when you click this, then you'll be transferred to the Azure sign-in page, where Azure will take care of logging you in using your existing Azure username and password. It will also transfer you to any multi-factor if you've got that configured. And once that's complete, then you'll be redirected back to Snowflake. You'll be logged in and you'll be ready to go. We have a couple of links on this page here to the documentation. There's documentation on both the Snowflake docs site, and there's also documentation on the Microsoft site, which walk you through how to configure single sign-on with Azure. The next part we're going to go through is the automated user provisioning piece. And this is where we configure Azure Active Directory to automatically send all of the users and automatically send all of the groups from your Azure AD into Snowflake. Now, when I say all of the users or all of the groups, you do have the ability to choose which users and which groups are sent to Snowflake automatically. So it doesn't have to be everybody in your entire Active Directory. But essentially, if you see the little pictures on the right there, at the top, these are some users in our Azure Active Directory. These could have also come from an on-premises directory that's been synchronized with Azure AD. They are created here. The second box down, we can see these users have been carried through automatically through to Snowflake, and the roles have also been carried through automatically through to Snowflake. So SCIM, System for Cross-Identity Management before. This is essentially an interface or an API which allows you to basically work with a system like Snowflake and create user and group operations like create user, create group, delete user, delete group, update, etc. And what we have with Azure is we have a SCIM connector for Azure that has been built by both Microsoft and Snowflake together. And essentially it is just a plugin that's part of Azure AD, which will handle the synchronization of these users. It's also possible to build your own connectors for your own directories. And we also have the SCIM integration for Okta, but we're not going to go through that today. So how the user provisioning works, you essentially have all your users already configured in your Microsoft Azure Active Directory. There is an agent that runs inside of Azure, which is our AAD agent. And then on a cycle, which is by default every 40 minutes, it will look for changes to users and groups, and then it will synchronize those across to Snowflake. Once they're synchronized across to Snowflake, then users will be able to log into Snowflake, and administrators will be able to configure additional permissions against roles or users on the Snowflake side. So let's jump across and have a look at how this stuff all works together. So first of all, let me bring up, I have a Snowflake instance here, and this is the one that I'm going to actually target and integrate to. I have my role right now set as account admin, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and have a look at that account admin tab, and we'll see that we have some users in our system already. We have an admin, a user, a Jane, a John. We have some roles, and these are some roles that are set up in our Snowflake system already. Right now, we've got nothing flowing from our Azure Active Directory at all, and this is what we're going to set up. If I also have a look at my Azure Active Directory, that's this window here. So I've logged on to Azure. I've selected Active Directory as the icon there, and I have actually created a directory already. This directory is called Snowflake November is the URL, and it's a test directory in this case. It is running the Azure AD Premium P2 SKU. If you want to be able to synchronize groups to Snowflake, you have to be on at least Premium P1 offering or above. If you're just on the free Azure AD, then you can only synchronize users and not groups. So in my Azure AD, I have some users configured already. I've created 2 users in here right now. One of them, apart from myself, that is, one of them is Charlotte, and one of them is Chris. I also have 2 groups configured in my Azure directory. One of them is Snowflake administrators, and one of them is sales analysts. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to configure my Azure directory so that these 2 groups here will automatically synchronize to Snowflake and bring any users that are assigned to these groups with them as well. Right now, though, we don't actually have any members of these groups. So we've just got 2 groups and 2 users. So the first thing I will do is I'll add Charlotte in to the Snowflake administrators group. And I will also add Chris into our sales analysts group. So now we've got those two users are configured. They're both members of groups, and now we're ready to go in and connect our Azure Active Directory to our Snowflake. So there are two parts to this. There is, first of all, we want to set up the single sign-on application in our Azure Active Directory, and then we want to go and configure the user provisioning. So what I'm going to do to add Snowflake to my Azure Active Directory is I'm first going to go to Enterprise Applications down on the left bar there. And then I am going to go New Application. I will search for Snowflake, which is in the gallery. I'll select that. And then I will hit the Add button. And what this will do is this will bring pre-configured objects into our Azure Active Directory so that we can then go and configure single sign-on and user provisioning for Snowflake. So that application has been added now, and what we have there is we have an application ID and an object ID, which are part of the Azure Active Directory. So what I can do at this point is I can assign some users and some groups. Right now, no users have this application. So what I will do is I'll hit the Add User button here. I will go and find, in this case, I'm actually going to find my two groups and select those and assign them to this application. So the first stage was assign some users and some groups. The second, I am going to set up single sign-on into my Snowflake system. And for Azure Active Directory, what we're going to use is a SAML connection. And then inside of our SAML, there are a few things that we need to set up. In the basic SAML configuration panel here, we need to set up a couple of URLs that will be pointing to our Snowflake system. And it gives you some patterns as to what they should look like for the identifier and for the reply URL here. I will just jump across to Snowflake and copy those URLs out of my worksheet here because it's easier than typing them out. So the first URL is essentially just the URL to your Snowflake instance. Then the reply URL is the same URL, but it also has the /fed/login added to the end of that URL. So this is the page that handles the single sign-on. So I'm going to hit save on that. And then I'm going to hit close on that window there. And I'm just going to say, no, I'll test later to single sign-on test. So our URLs are configured. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to this SAML signing certificate, and I'm going to download this base64 certificate. And we're going to need that to insert that into Snowflake when we finish configuring on the Snowflake side. The other thing on the Snowflake side is we're going to need this login URL to configure. So I'll just copy that to my clipboard right now. And then I will jump back over to Snowflake. And this command here that we're going to be running inside of Snowflake, it's in the documentation. You'll be able to copy and paste it from the links that walk you through how to configure Snowflake SSO. But essentially, there are two things that we need to fill in the query that they give us, the template. First of them is the actual SAML login URL that we got from our system and just copied. And then the second thing is the contents of this certificate that we've downloaded from our Azure portal. So let me just find that file. And I'm going to just, 1 second, I'm just going to open that with a text editor. It downloads it as a a base64 certificate. And if I open that in a text editor, then we see that certificate as a big chunk of text. Now, one thing that we need to remember is when we're copying this certificate out and putting this into Snowflake, we want to omit the begin certificate and end certificate pieces. So we're just going to copy the text from in the middle of that. We're going to paste that in between the quotes here. And then we're going to run each of these statements. First, to set account admin as our role. Second, we're going to set this SAML identity provider on our account. And then we're going to tell it to use the SSO login page. And if I just, at this point in time, if I just take a copy of this URL, open a new private browsing window and paste that in. From now on, what we should see is a new box there which says log in using Azure AD. Now I can't do this just yet because I don't have any users synchronized to my Azure AD. What I can do is I could actually come into Snowflake here and I could manually create some users in here where the username and the login name match what I have in my directory. So if I have a look at my Active Directory and have a look at my users, if I made Chris at Snowflake November on Microsoft.com, if I added this user manually into Snowflake here, then I would be able to go and log into Snowflake using single sign-on. So it is possible to do this without automating the user provisioning. But generally, we prefer to have this work in an automated fashion so we don't have to do all these manual steps. So the second thing we're going to do is we're going to go back to Azure and we are going to go back to our Snowflake application, which is now configured and in the list. And we are going to now configure the automated user provisioning. So we've just done the single sign-on. We're now going to do provisioning. So if I select provisioning on the left-hand side here, what we're going to see momentarily is the page where we can go and configure the Azure AD provisioning. And for some reason, it's running a little bit slow refreshing that screen today. Let's try clicking through that again. Okay, here we go. So what we can do from this side is we can flip the provisioning mode from manual, which it is right now, which means that you could manually create your users in the Snowflake system, and we will switch this to automatic. Now, in order to make this provisioning mode automatic, we then need to go and configure some more credentials on the Azure Active Directory side, which Azure AD will use to talk to Snowflake and essentially then write those users and those groups to Snowflake. So to get these values here, we need to jump back to Snowflake and run some more SQL, which is again on the documentation links that we have. And that's the SQL here. So essentially we're going to be running as account admin again. We will, in this case, create a role inside of Snowflake called AAD Provisioner. Doesn't have to be called this, but this is nice and easy to use and straight out of the docs. We will grant the create user rights to this role. And we also grant the create role rights to this role. So what that means is that when Azure AD connects, it will be able to create users and create roles directly inside of Snowflake. So we're going to give the account admin this role, and then we're going to create what we call a security integration. So this is something that will sit in the background inside of Snowflake, and it will essentially be able to connect to this integration, and Azure AD will be able to create those users. Then lastly, what we need to do is we need to generate a special access token on the Snowflake side, which will be essentially a password for Azure AD to access Snowflake and generate these users. So when I run this command, I will get a nice big complex password, and I'm going to copy this out. And this token, this password, is what we need to paste over here on our Azure AD in the secret token. The tenant URL itself, that's actually going to be just our URL that we access Snowflake with a extension of /SCIM/v2 on it. So now we've got the URL and the token configured here. If I hit the test connection, this should go, and Azure AD will actually try and talk to Snowflake's SCIM API, and it says it's working. So that means that we've copied and pasted all of those correctly. So I am going to next come down and have a look at our mappings, but first it tells me we've got to hit the save button to save these credentials. So I'll hit save. The page will now refresh, and then we can go and have a look at how our users and how our groups are mapped from AD to Snowflake. So under mappings, as you see, we have by default, synchronize Azure Active Directory groups to Snowflake is enabled, and also synchronize Azure Active Directory users to Snowflake is also enabled. If we click on these, we can actually see what attributes are mapped from AD to Snowflake. And in the case of groups, we just have the display name of the group and then the members. So these are each of the users that are part of that group will be mapped across. For our users, we have a few more attributes that are coming across. One of them is the user principal name, or the UPN. And this is mapped to the Snowflake username. And this is essentially the login name that you will use when you log into Snowflake. And it's also the same as the login name that you use when you're logging on to other applications from Azure AD. I'm not going to change any of these default attributes. I don't need to, so I'll just leave those as is. I do want both my groups and my users to synchronize, so I'll leave them both as enabled. And all that's left to do now is to set the provisioning status to on and hit save. And now in the background, that should start synchronizing my users from my Azure AD across into Snowflake. And if I refresh the screen, hopefully we should see some statistics around that provisioning status. Okay, so it says here that with complete provisioning details will tell us the last time this is completed. So in New Zealand right now, it's 4:23 p.m. So that's when that's happened. And you'll see right here that the provisioning interval is configured at 40 minutes. So assuming that everything has magically worked in the background right now, what we should see when we come back across to Snowflake and have a look at our accounts, at our users is, and we do, hooray, we see 2 users that have come across now from Azure AD. We see Charlotte and we see Chris. And we should also see the roles that we configured to come across. So Snowflake administrators and sales analysts were the 2 roles that we configured. So right now, those users could log into Snowflake, but they can't really do anything in Snowflake because they don't really have any rights that are assigned. So we can do a number of things. One thing we can do is we can come down to our Snowflake, and we can actually grant some permissions to those rules so that those users will then be able to access warehouses and databases and the like. So let me just grab some SQL and drop this in here. And we what did we call this role here? We called it Sales Analysts. So let me just make this Sales Analysts, and I will just copy and paste that. And then I'll just run all of these statements. And what that will do is it'll grant usage to the database, our CityBike database, our schema, tables and views, and a warehouse to our Sales Analyst role. And our Sales Analyst role, if we look back at our Active Directory, we will see that the members include Chris Green. So now what we should be able to do is we should be able to go and log in to Snowflake as Chris. We'll be authenticated by Azure Active Directory on the way in, and we'll use our Azure AD password. And then we should be able to access some tables and databases inside of Snowflake. So here I am logging in. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say log in using Azure AD. And my user is going to be Chris at novembertest.onmicrosoft.com. I didn't use a custom domain for this Active Directory. Then, whoops, let me just check what I had. Snowflake November, sorry, was the URL. So let me jump back to that one and put the right username in there. And when I created this user, it gave me a default password, which I'm just going to type in now. I haven't actually logged into AD with this user before. So the first thing it's going to do, I'm going to put my default password in, and then it's going to ask me to change that password. But what you're seeing here, this is the Azure AD, which is asking us to enter in and change these passwords, not in Snowflake. The user's passwords don't actually go to Snowflake at all. They're only held in Azure AD. But once we have completed the login here, then we will be redirected back to Snowflake. And we're in, okay. And if I change my role now to Sales Analysts, then assuming that I set those permissions correctly, which maybe I didn't. Well, here's my database. Here's my warehouse that I gave access to. And if I go and select the Sales Analyst role here, select the warehouse, select the database and the schema, then I should be able to then go and query our data. Oops. Oh, I didn't give any access to any of the tables. Okay, so what we can do is we could go and then grant explicitly the access to those tables. The other way that we can actually work with our roles is we could go and that Sales Analyst role, we could actually also grant the a different role, like the Analyst CityBike role here, and essentially have that role inherit the Analyst CityBike permissions. And then, okay, probably should have put a limit on that because that's quite a bit table. And now we've got access to our trips table, and we'll also see, if we go to change role, that we can also see the Analyst CityBike role. But our Azure Active Directory group is Sales Analysts, and we can either put permissions directly against Sales Analyst or have Sales Analyst role inherit some other standard Snowflake role that we already have, and our permissions will just then flow through. So that was our our Azure user. created in our Azure directory, logging through into Snowflake and having the permissions for the databases and things assigned to roles on the Snowflake side, but our users are managed in the Azure Active Directory. So that was sending a user through. There's a few other things that we can also do with Azure AD. One of those things is we can actually go and do something like, in fact, let me just log out from here first and close this window. But in Azure AD, if I hit the block sign-in button and then hit save, this will essentially disable this user and stop them from being able to access Snowflake. So if I now go and attempt to log in to Snowflake, oops. Let me just grab the URL again. And attempt to log in using Azure AD and that Chris user. Then what I should see is it should block me from being able to log in. Okay, so your account has been locked. Contact somebody to unlock it, try again. So when this happened, we blocked this user at the Azure AD level. The synchronization to Snowflake hasn't actually happened yet because it only runs every 40 minutes. But because when we log into Snowflake, we go via the Azure AD authentication, this will take effect immediately. So as soon as this is set on Azure AD, that user will be locked out of Snowflake. So if you can picture a scenario where somebody has left the company, it's very easy to just go in and block their login in one place, and they will then lose access to all of their applications, including Snowflake. We can, or if they're traveling and they lose some credentials, we could do that. If we then go and unblock it again, then once that's updated, Chris should then be able to log in once more. It's kind of hanging for a moment. It's finished updating. Let's just refresh the screen. Okay, didn't like that. Maybe we need to just start a new window to do that. Once again, log in as Chris. And once again, we have access to Snowflake. So it makes it nice and easy to manage your users and send them across to Snowflake without having to manually create all your users in Snowflake. But one thing that it also does is it actually gives you the ability as well to then use things like multi-factor authentication from the Azure AD side. So if we wanted to, for example, we could actually go and configure this user, Chris. We could configure multi-factor authentication on this user. And in this case here, we could enable it. And then when Chris goes to log in next time, he's going to be required, or she's going to be required, to then go and set up multi-factor. So if I go to the Microsoft AD user portal, myapps.microsoft.com, now we've made that setting. It says, it needs more information. It's going to ask me to configure multi-factor. So I will use a mobile app in this stage and a verification code. We can use an automated notification as well. And I have an authenticator app on my phone. You can't see that on the screen there, but just take my word for it. I'm scanning that QR code now, and it's creating it on my mobile phone. And it's just checking to see that that's activated. Okay, we go next. And it wants me to enter the code, which is 031495, verify. And then it's going to ask me to put in a text or a mobile number in case I forget my password and need to do some resets. Done. Okay. So now if I close down that application and then attempt to log into Snowflake again, what I will receive next time is I'll actually have to do a multi-factor authentication before I can access Snowflake. So once again, I'll use Azure AD. I will use Chris at Snowflake November on Microsoft.com. I'll put in my password. And then at this point, you'll see that it's asking me for my multi-factor authentication code. So I'm going to go to my phone and type in the code I'm seeing right now, and hit verify. And at this point, assuming I type the code in right, now we will be logged in and able to access Snowflake using multi-factor that has been pushed down from our Azure Active Directory. Okay, so other things that will happen with our users, if we, in Azure, if we go and, if we add new users here into our Azure Active Directory, what we can do is we can add a new user here, and just create a new user called John Doe, and I'll create that. There's two ways for getting this user John Doe to access Snowflake from this point. First of all, I can simply add John to the group for either Snowflake administrators or sales analysts, and then he will automatically flow through to Snowflake the next time the synchronization runs. So let me just do that. The other way that we can do that is we can actually go and manually assign the Snowflake application to that user, and then his user will flow across regardless of whether he has a group assigned. So in this case here, we only have the two groups, but we could add a user specifically. So we could add a user like this. I won't do that though, because I like to manage my users via groups rather than individually. So now what we should see, if we have a look at our provisioning, it hasn't been 40 minutes yet, so we're not going to see that user across on the Snowflake side yet. If I have a look at accounts and users, he's not there. If I want to kind of trick this into going a bit faster, what I can do at this from the GUI point of view is I can turn the provisioning off and save it. And then I can turn the provisioning on again and save it again, and that will force it to do an immediate synchronization. And if I hit the refresh button, eventually what we'll see once it's done that synchronization is this user should go up to 3. But while we're waiting for that, there is also, if you look down the bottom here, there is a view audit logs link. And if I select through to that, then what we can see is we can see a log of all of the operations that have happened from Azure AD and into Snowflake. So what you can see, if we drill into one of these, there's a activity type import. In this case, this was for the username Chris, and at this point in time, it has gone and created this user Chris into Snowflake, and there will be also rules for the groups as well. So we can see group Snowflake administrators is getting in Snowflake as well. And then there will also be another step which actually sends the list of members across to Snowflake to show that they belong to those groups. Now let's have a look at the provisioning here. Okay, now that provisioning has happened, it says we've got 3 users that have been sent across. We can see that happened, a few minutes ago or a minute ago. And if we go back to Snowflake, we should now see John is now configured inside of Snowflake. And he should be part of that, that role. Sales analysts, I think we made him too. Yes, so now he's showing in there as a member of sales analysts. So now if we went and logged into Snowflake as John, we would immediately get access to that City Bike database and tables and be able to start using Snowflake. Okay, so that's it from a walking through on a demo perspective. So let me just jump back to the slide deck here. So what we did, we went through, in Azure AD, we went through and we added the Snowflake app to our Azure AD. Then we went in and we configured our single sign-on for our SSO. Then we configured our automatic provisioning using SCIM through the provisioning. And then we assigned some users and some groups. In this case, we just assigned the groups to the Snowflake app in Azure. We did, on the steps that we just went through, we also added the SAML configuration using the Snowflake URLs and the reply URL with the fed login piece. We downloaded that certificate that we then used when we went to the Snowflake side. So we created the SAML identity provider inside of Snowflake. We set our certificate in here and we set the login URL to the Azure AD URL. And that was essentially setting up SSO. We then set up the SCIM in Snowflake. So we created a role for our security integration. Then we created a token, and this token was what we used to then configure Azure AD with this URL and then the token that we generated. And we turned our provisioning on, and then our user and groups flowed through to Snowflake. So there are some things to remember with this integration, and one of them is probably not to keep pushing all the buttons. So the first thing is that token that we generated only lasts for 6 months. So what we need to do is we actually need to set up a reminder to regenerate that token every 6 months and update our Azure Active Directory. Now, this is something that you could automate using DevOps. The generate token is just a SQL statement that we can run against Snowflake. And then also updating this on our Azure AD is something that we can do through the Azure CLI or the Azure PowerShell. So it would be possible to create, a DevOps process that would generate the new token and then update our Azure AD every X number of months. Something else to remember is that role management through the AD groups. Once again, role management through the AD groups means that you lead at least the Azure Active Directory P1 plan, a premium plan. So you do need to be paying for Azure AD if you want to have the groups synchronized across. You can have just user accounts synchronized across on the free Azure AD plan, but if you want the groups, which is where all of the best part of this comes from, then you need to have one of the premium plans. And then lastly, we were using Snowflake on AWS today, along with our Azure Active Directory. So you can actually use Azure AD integration regardless of where you deploy Snowflake. Once we have Google Cloud up and running, you'll also be able to configure the single sign-on and the automated provisioning to Snowflake running on Google as well. So when you do integrate your Snowflake with Azure AD using the federated authentication in the SSO and the SCIM connector, effectively what you get is the ability for your users to use a single username and password to access all of their systems, their email, as well as their Snowflake. It gives your user administrators the ability to manage those Snowflake roles using Azure Active Directory or on-premises Active Directory if they have that synchronizing through to Azure Active Directory. So that essentially means that your administration team can use one tool to also manage the application for Snowflake. And with that provisioning, it means that those Active Directory groups and the Active Directory users will automatically be sent down to Snowflake. And once they're in Snowflake, that's where you can then apply specific permissions for users and for groups on operating against databases or warehouses, etc. So that is the Azure Active Directory integration with Snowflake in a nutshell. Do we have any more questions from the audience?
So there have been a couple of questions, but they've been answered so far. If anybody has questions, please post them into the Q&A panel and we'll answer them.
And just reminding you that the recording of this webinar will go out tomorrow via email. So you will have, all of the, all of the webinar recorded so that you can review it again. We do have a question coming in here. Can we have the URL first slide for the instructions again? Okay. So let me grab my...
I've just posted the response there. Just a link to the SCIM documentation in the online docs.
Excellent. Thanks, Alan. Yeah, so the Microsoft documentation links that are both there are very good step-by-step. And if you follow those, you have essentially everything you need to configure the integration.
All right, we'll give it a moment to see if there are any other final questions. There don't seem to be any coming through, Regan, so maybe we'll wrap it up here. As Regan said, we will be sending out the recording of this, and they'll, Regan, I'm sure we can also make the slides that you've got here available as well.
Yes, we can. I'll drop them into a PDF and I will provide them to Meg to figure out how that we can make them available to everybody.
Terrific. And if you've got any further questions, you can obviously reply to the follow-up email that will be sent out, and we will help answer any questions.
There is one more question that's just come in from Amit, which is when there are existing roles in Snowflake, how can they be integrated to Azure AD? So this synchronization is one way. If you have roles in Snowflake, they don't go back to Azure AD. But with the Azure SCIM connector, if you have a role in Snowflake that has the same group name as a group in AD, then Azure AD should be able to connect to that same role and synchronize members into it.
I think the only thing that you need to do is you just need to make sure that the role ownership is transferred across to the AAD role.
Provisioner, yeah. Good point.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned before, this is the Azure AD provisioning. We do also have the ability to do automated user provisioning if you're using Okta, for example. So there is also an Okta SCIM connector, which is similar to the Azure AD one. So if you're using Okta instead of Azure AD, then there's also a SCIM connector for automating those. And of course, there's also a native SSO integration for Okta too.
Terrific. All right, well, we'll wrap it up there. Regan, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. Fantastic presentation.
And thank you to everybody for online.